The first time the Federation Enforcement Authority arrived in the Sol system, they did so with the quiet confidence of an institution that had never been meaningfully challenged, their white and gold hulls sliding out of superluminal space in precise formation as if the laws of the universe themselves deferred to their schedules, and from the bridge of the human diplomatic vessel Aegis Accord, Ambassador Lena Ortiz watched the display with a tight jaw while the alien ships fanned out and began broadcasting automated compliance notices that cited subsection after subsection of Federation security law, each one outlining humanity's alleged violations in the calm, instructional tone of a parent correcting a child, and around her the human crew remained outwardly calm, years of training keeping their faces neutral even as the meaning of the moment settled in. Because this was not a misunderstanding or a routine inspection, but an assertion of authority, a declaration that the Federation had decided humanity required supervision, that the species which had clawed its way from a single gravity well into the wider galaxy through hard compromises and careful diplomacy was now being categorized as potential destabilizing element, and the irony was not lost on Ortiz as she listened to the message repeat in 3 Federation trade languages. Since humanity's so-called violations amounted to refusing to submit its deep space patrols to Federation command oversight and declining to share the full specifications of its newer ship classes, choices made not in aggression but in caution after centuries of watching larger powers collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. Yet from the perspective of the Federation Council, a body dominated by species that had known interstellar civilization for millennia, caution from a newcomer looked like defiance, and defiance required correction. Fire across the system on the Enforcement Authority flagship Resolute Measure, High. Adjudicator Veltais reviewed the situation with mild irritation, his elongated eyes flicking over sensor readouts that confirmed what the Council already believed, that humanity's visible fleet assets were modest, their ships sturdy but unremarkable, their weapons output within expected parameters for a species barely 3 centuries removed from its first faster-than-light experiments. And Tyes allowed himself a private moment of satisfaction as he prepared the formal demand for compliance. Convinced that this display of force would end as all others had, with the lesser power issuing protest for the record before quietly submitting, because the Federation did not conquer, it regulated, and regulation was always framed as protection, even as it stripped autonomy from those deemed too impulsive to wield it responsibly, and yet there was an undercurrent of unease that Tyes did not fully acknowledge, a nagging reminder of old archival references he had skimmed and dismissed, fragments of warnings from extinct or withdrawn species that described humans as patient to a fault until patience ran out, as dangerously adaptive, as a people who treated restraint not as weakness but as policy, and on Earth, in a secure chamber beneath layers of atmosphere and bedrock, Admiral Marcus Hale stood before a wall of real-time projections, his gray hair and lined face betraying decades of service that had taught him when to fight and when to wait, and he listened as Ortiz's report concluded, his fingers steepled not in anger but in contemplation, because this moment had been anticipated long before the first Federation ship crossed into Sol, modeled and debated in rooms just like this one. And when Hale finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost gentle, as he instructed Fleet Command to initiate Phase 1 of the Transparency Protocol, a move that would show the Federation exactly what it expected to see. Limited patrol groups, cooperative signals, open channels, and behind that facade, preparations that would remain invisible to anyone who did not know where to look, because humanity had learned early that survival among the stars required not just strength but the wisdom to hide it, and as Federation enforcement craft began deploying inspection drones and positioning themselves around Earth and its colonies with the methodical care of a power accustomed to obedience. The humans complied with every reasonable request, opened every door that had been designed to be opened, and offered every explanation that had been rehearsed, all while deeper within the system, beyond the heliopause and masked by phenomena the Federation considered too chaotic to merit close study. Engines that did not appear on any registry began to warm, ancient shipyards long thought dormant activated in silence, and crews who had trained for decades without ever firing a shot in anger took their places. Because humanity understood something the Federation did not, that policing only works on those who accept the authority behind it, and the day that authority was imposed without consent was the day the real fleet would begin to move. As the Federation presence settled into what it considered a stable enforcement posture, High Adjudicator Veltais transmitted his first direct communique to Earth, his image appearing above the circular table in the Sol diplomatic chamber with measured composure as he explained that expanded inspections and command integration were temporary safeguards designed to prevent humanity from destabilizing neighboring sectors. And Lena Ortiz listened without interruption before responding with, "Practice civility, affirming humanity's commitment to peace while firmly reiterating its refusal to place its independent fleets under foreign command, a stance that ties logged as noncompliance but not yet hostility, because the Federation's doctrine assumed resistance would erode under sustained pressure, and so the pressure increased in subtle ways as patrol corridors were narrowed. Shipping schedules delayed for additional verification, and human merchant captains found themselves rerouted or fined under newly interpreted regulations, each incident small enough to justify on its own yet together forming a tightening net that the Federation believed would compel cooperation. But on Mars, in the basal halls of Fleet Command, Admiral Hale observed the data streams with a strategist's eye and noted how predictably the enforcement pattern unfolded, mirroring historical cases where the Federation had absorbed or neutralized emerging powers, and he authorized Phase 2A. Quiet reallocation of resources that shifted industrial output toward facilities officially listed as decommissioned or civilian, while crews rotated through assignments that appeared routine but were in fact final readiness drills, and out in the asteroid belts and shadowed Lagrange points. Vessels whose transponders marked them as survey craft or maintenance hulks began subtle course corrections, aligning themselves into formations that would only become visible when viewed as a whole. Something Federation analysts never thought to do because the doctrine discounted the possibility of a hidden human reserve, and the first real fracture appeared when a Federation patrol attempted to board a human escort frigate guarding a relief convoy bound for the Celt refugee enclaves, a population displaced by earlier Federation arbitration failures, and Captain Jonah Reyes, following standing orders, refused the boarding while maintaining course, his calm transmission citing humanitarian protections under interstellar law. And when the patrol moved to disable his engines, Reyes executed a defensive maneuver that neutralized the enforcement ship's weapons without destroying it, a technical feat that stunned local commanders and triggered immediate escalation reports up the chain, prompting TIES to convene an emergency council session where some members expressed concern that humanity's capabilities were being underestimated, but the majority dismissed the incident as an anomaly, attributing it to human improvisation rather than systemic superiority, and voted to authorize limited force to assert authority, a decision that reached Hale within minutes and was met not with surprise but with quiet nod as he gave the order to initiate Phase 3 containment, which involved withdrawing visible assets from contested zones while allowing Federation forces to advance into positions that looked advantageous on paper but were in reality carefully mapped kill corridors. And as enforcement fleets pushed deeper into Sol space, they encountered increasingly sophisticated interference, sensor ghosts, communications lag, navigational errors that could not be traced to any conventional jamming technology, leading Federation crews to grow uneasy even as their superiors insisted control was being maintained. And it was during this period that the first human countermessage was broadcast galaxy-wide, not a threat or a declaration of war, but a historical record compiled from Federation archive themselves, detailing prior enforcement actions that had led to cultural collapse, economic exploitation, or outright extinction of smaller species, accompanied by a simple statement from Earth's assembly that humanity would not permit the same outcome for itself or others under its protection, a message that resonated far beyond Sol and began to shift public opinion in neutral systems. Something the Federation had not anticipated, because it had never face a species willing to challenge not just its fleets but its narrative, and as dissent grew and enforcement commanders demanded clearer directives, TIES realized too late that policing humanity was not producing submission but unity, and in the dark between stars, the last concealed elements of the real fleet completed their activation cycles, awaiting only a signal that would irrevocably change the balance of power. When the Federation Council authorized limited force, the announcement was framed as a necessary corrective measure, and across member systems the official feeds repeated the same phrasing about restoring balance and ensuring compliance. Yet within days the practical effect became impossible to ignore as enforcement task groups began seizing control of relay stations and navigation hubs traditionally operated jointly with local authorities, prompting concern even among long-aligned species who had tolerated Federation overreach in past. And on the bridge of the Resolute Measure, Veltai studied the updated tactical map with growing frustration as human ships continued to withdraw just ahead of advancing patrols, never retreating in panic or disarray but repositioning with deliberateness that suggested intent rather than fear. And his subordinates reported mounting technical anomalies as weapons locks failed at critical moments and targeting solutions returned probabilities instead of coordinates, phenomena that Federation engineers insisted were impossible given known human technology, while on Earth Admiral Hale addressed a closed session of the Assembly and Senior Command, outlining the next phase with the tone of a man explaining an unpleasant but necessary task, reminding them that restraint had preserved peace for decades, but that restraint was now being interpreted as vulnerability. And authorization was granted unanimously to reveal select capabilities in a controlled manner, not to shock the galaxy but to force recalibration, and the first demonstration occurred near the outer colonies where a Federation strike group attempted to impose a no-transit zone, only to find its ships surrounded by human vessels that had appeared without detectable approach vectors, their drives exploiting gravitational harmonics the Federation had never mapped, and Captain Reyes, now promoted and commanding a task force, opened a channel to the strike group commander and offered safe passage out of the system in exchange for immediate withdrawal, his tone professional and devoid of triumph. And when the offer was refused, he executed precision maneuver that disabled every Federation ship simultaneously, shutting down reactors and leaving hulls intact, drifting but alive, an outcome that sent shockwaves through Enforcement Command and could not be spun as an accident or anomaly. And footage of the encounter leaked despite censorship attempts, spreading rapidly through civilian networks and prompting emergency debates in systems far removed from Sol, while Ties faced the first formal vote of no confidence in his adjudication, a procedural move that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. And in private he reviewed the suppressed archival warnings in full, no longer skimming, recognizing patterns he had dismissed, descriptions of humans as builders of layered contingencies, as strategists who plan for failure as thoroughly as success. And the realization settled heavily that the Federation had not uncovered hidden weapons so much as stumbled into a civilization that had structured its entire expansion around the assumption that one day it would need to defend its autonomy against a larger power. And as more enforcement groups found themselves neutralized without loss of life, a fact humanity emphasized in every communication, the narrative shifted from policing to provocation, with allied species openly questioning whether the Federation was safeguarding stability or enforcing dominance. And Hale, watching political fractures widen, delayed the final reveal, understanding that the true strength of the real fleet lay not just in firepower but in the legitimacy that came from demonstrating capability without cruelty. And so when the signal finally came, it was not an order to attack but a coordinated emergence, as hundreds of previously unregistered human capital ships translated into visible space across multiple sectors, their presence undeniable yet their weapons cold, a statement written in mass and discipline rather than destruction, and across the galaxy leaders recalculated, enforcement commanders hesitated, and Veltais, standing alone on his bridge, understood that the Federation was no longer the sole arbiter of order, and that in trying to police humanity it had forced the galaxy to confront a new reality where power was balanced by those who had learned to hide it until it was needed. The sudden appearance of the human capital formations forced an emergency convocation of the Federation Council, and for the first time in its recorded history the chamber was filled not with confidence but with uncertainty as delegates argued over projections that no longer converged on a favorable outcome, while across the affected sectors Federation enforcement crews reported a phenomenon that unsettled even veteran officers, that human ships held position without posturing, without threats, without the aggressive energy signatures that usually preceded violence, creating a tension more profound than open hostility, because no one could predict how far restraint extended or where the line truly lay. And in Sol, Lena Ortiz addressed the assembly with a message carefully crafted to be impossible to misinterpret, stating that humanity did not seek to dismantle the Federation or supplant its influence, only to assert that no external authority would dictate human defense policy or limit its ability to protect allied systems, a statement that was immediately rebroadcast by dozens of non-member worlds who saw in humanity a counterweight they had never dared imagine, and on the resolute measure, Veltais attempted to regain initiative by ordering a strategic withdrawal framed as escalation, but the order fractured as some commanders complied while others, driven by pride or fear of political consequences, attempted localized shows of force that were swiftly and lethally countered by human response units that anticipated their moves with unnerving accuracy, reinforcing perception that humanity had mapped Federation doctrine down to the decision trees of individual captains. And as the standoff stretched into days, analysts across the galaxy began to understand that the real fleet was not a last-minute construction but the visible tip of a deeply integrated system of logistics, intelligence, and command redundancy that allowed humans to project power without centralization, making decapitation strategies useless, and Admiral Hale used this interval to authorize direct talks with disaffected Federation members, offering mutual defense pacts and technological exchanges without demands for subordination, a diplomatic approach that contrasted sharply with Federation enforcement culture and accelerated political realignment. And when a fringe Federation species attempted to exploit the chaos by attacking a protected neutral convoy, humanity responded decisively, deploying overwhelming force that obliterated the aggressor's fleet in seconds, the first true act of destruction in the conflict. And the message was unmistakable. Restraint was a choice, not a limitation, and its withdrawal was selective, causing even hardline council members to reconsider the cost of continued escalation. And as casualty reports and economic disruptions mounted, pressure on Tai became unsustainable, culminating in his removal and replacement by an interim counselor who immediately signaled willingness to negotiate new terms. And in a quiet moment on Earth, Hale reflected that the real fleet had finally been seen. But its purpose was not conquest or domination. It was to ensure that humanity would never again be mistaken for something that could be managed or contained. And as negotiations began under the shadow of human formations holding steady across the stars, the galaxy faced a fundamental shift, one where authority would have to be earned through consent rather than enforced through assumption, because humanity had made it clear that policing only worked until patrol met something it could not intimidate. Negotiations opened not in the grand halls of the Federation Council, but aboard a neutral station long ignored by major powers, chosen deliberately by humanity to signal a departure from ritual dominance. And as delegations arrived, they were met by an unmistakable sight. Human ships arrayed at a respectful distance, yet in numbers that rendered any thought of coercion absurd. And inside the station, Lena Ortiz took her seat across from the interim counselor Sail Corin, whose species had built its reputation on compromise rather than conquest, setting a tone that contrasted sharply with Veltias' tenure. And Corin began by acknowledging what the galaxy already understood, that the Federation's attempt to police humanity had failed not because of insufficient force, but because its foundational assumptions were flawed. And Ortiz responded by laying out humanity's position in plain terms, recounting Earth's own history of empires, alliances, and regulatory bodies that had collapsed when they confused order with control, emphasizing that humans had joined the wider galaxy seeking cooperation, not permission. And as discussions progressed, it became clear to observers that humanity's leverage was not derived solely from its fleets but from the alternatives it offered: shared patrol responsibilities instead of centralized enforcement, transparent arbitration rather than unilateral rulings, and mutual defense agreements that preserved sovereignty, proposals that resonated deeply with species long resentful of Federation oversight. And Admiral Hale, participating remotely, authorized limited data releases demonstrating how human systems integrated civilian and military infrastructure in ways that maximize resilience without crippling economies, a revelation that unsettled Federation planners who realized how dependent their model was on rigid hierarchies. And outside the negotiation chamber, the real fleet maintained its posture, quietly interdicting piracy and responding to distress calls regardless of affiliation, actions that were carefully documented and broadcast, reshaping public perception as humanity was seen not as a challenger seeking dominance, but as a stabilizing force that acted without demanding tribute or allegiance. And when a breakaway Federation admiral attempted a coup in a peripheral sector, hoping to rally hardliners by striking at a human-aligned system, the response was immediate and overwhelming. The rogue fleet dismantled in minutes and its leadership detained and delivered alive to a neutral tribunal, an outcome that demonstrated both capability and restraint in equal measure. And within the Federation Council, dissent hardened into a reckoning as member world demanded reforms or threatened withdrawal, forcing Corin to concede that the era of unilateral policing was over. And as draft accords circulated, they bore the imprint of human influence, limits on enforcement authority, mandatory review of sanctions, and recognition of the right of emerging powers to maintain independent defense, clauses that would have been unthinkable months earlier. And in Sol, Hale briefed the assembly on contingency plans should talks fail, but his tone carried a note of cautious optimism, because the galaxy was responding not with fear but recalibration, and humanity's long investment in patience was finally yielding dividends. And as the fifth day of negotiations closed, Ortiz looked out through the station viewport at the distant glow of human ships holding their silent vigil and understood that the real fleet had achieved its purpose not by firing its guns but by forcing the galaxy to accept a simple truth, that order imposed without respect was just another form of violence, and humanity would no longer tolerate either. As the revised accords moved toward ratification, resistance did not vanish but transformed, shifting from overt confrontation to covert maneuvering as entrenched interests within the Federation sought to preserve fragments of their old authority through proxies and deniable actions, and human intelligence picked up the pattern almost immediately, tracing disruptions in trade lanes and sudden flare-ups of border violence to the same networks that had once fed enforcement fleets there. Intelligence, and Admiral Hale authorized countermeasures that operated in full compliance with the emerging framework, exposing corruption, releasing intercepted communications, and allowing neutral courts to dismantle the remnants of the policing apparatus piece by piece, a process far more devastating to its architects than any battlefield defeat, because it stripped away legitimacy along with power, and Lena Ortiz found her role evolving from negotiator to architect as she worked with Sale, Corin and a coalition of reform-minded delegates to establish the Interstellar Compact, a body designed not to command fleets but to coordinate responses, its charter explicitly forbidding unilateral enforcement actions without multilateral consent. And while critics warned that such restraint would invite chaos, early operations told a different story as human task groups, now operating alongside former Federation patrols, demonstrated how distributed authority combined with rapid response could suppress threats more efficiently than centralized control, and the real fleet, though still present, began a gradual drawdown, its formations dispersing back into obscurity as deliberately as they had emerged, signaling that humanity did not intend to rule by perpetual intimidation, and this withdrawal unsettled some observers more than the initial show of force, because it reinforced a lesson that human power was not contingent on constant visibility, and in a final test of the new order, a long simmering conflict between two non-aligned species threatened to escalate into open war, prompting Compact to invoke its first collective mediation, and when talks stalled, humanity deployed a mixed civilian and military delegation that combined aid, security guarantees, and enforceable arbitration in a single package, ending the crisis without a shot fired and setting a precedent that resonated across the stars. And as reports of the success circulated, worlds that had once clung to Federation protection petition for Compact membership, accelerating the decline of the old Council's influence, and on Earth Hale addressed a new generation of officers, reminding them that the real fleet was not just steel and engine but doctrine, culture, and memory, built from humanity's refusal to forget its own past mistakes, and in a quiet exchange with Ortiz he acknowledged that the galaxy would test this balance again, perhaps sooner than anyone hoped, but for now humanity had achieved something rare, a deterrence rooted not in fear of annihilation, but in confidence that provocation would meet a response both decisive and just. And as the stars settled into a new pattern of alliances and expectations, the lesson endured that the Federation's attempt to police humanity had not only failed, but had given rise to a broader reckoning, one that reshaped interstellar order around the understanding that true stability could only exist when power answered to principle, rather than presumption. The formal dissolution of the Federation Enforcement Authority occurred quietly, without ceremony, its mandate absorbed and nullified by the Interstellar Compact in a vote that reflected not triumph but exhaustion, as centuries of assumed dominance gave way to a pragmatic acceptance that the galaxy had changed, and in the aftermath humanity resisted every call to occupy the vacuum left behind, declining permanent seats of command, and instead embedding liaison teams that advised rather than directed, a choice that puzzled some but reassured many more, and Lena Ortiz returned to Earth not as a conquering hero but as a public servant who had helped steer disaster into transformation, while Sale Corin oversaw the painful restructuring of his own government with transparency that restored trust long eroded by enforcement excesses, and Admiral Hale, standing once more before the Assembly, ordered the final reclassification of the real fleet, its existence acknowledged but its details sealed, Not as a threat, but as a reminder that preparedness was not something to be flaunted or forgotten. And across human space, a concealed shipyards returned to dormancy, crews rotating back into civilian life with a quiet satisfaction of having done what they trained to do without becoming what they feared. And in distant systems, stories spread not of humanity's firepower, but of its choices, of a species that could have shattered its challenges and instead reshaped the rules that enabled the challenge. And when historians later marked the turning point, they did not cite a battle or decisive strike, but the moment the Federation tried to police a people who understood the authority imposed without consent was unsustainable, and by forcing that confrontation, humanity had compelled the galaxy to grow beyond a model built on intimidation. And in the end, the real fleet vanished from public view not because it was no longer needed, but because its lesson had been learned. That humanity's greatest strength was not the power it unleashed, but the power it restrained, and the knowledge that if ever tested again, it would respond not out of rage or ambition, but with the same calm certainty that had carried it from a single world to a defining role among the stars.